Yeah, in terms of developing the narrative and these different forms of disembodiment or different, in the context of this symposium on drones, of course, the question of being unmanned and drones as one aspect of a kind of regime of telepresent activities that's impacting across society. So that the drone emerges, and we're talking about that this weekend, but the call center in India emerges, the gold farmers emerge, the telepresent surgery emerges. So there's all of these types of telepresent or disembodied activities that emerge simultaneously. The drone is one. And so for me, though, I didn't start with the drone. I started with the remote worker. In the 90s, I was talking to a friend of mine about the notion of telecommuting, which in the 90s, in the early days of the internet, one of even though the bandwidth was very limited, the dreams and the metaphors were very expansive. And so there was an article about how soon everybody would be working from home and there'd be no traffic, no people on the subways, et cetera. And so I coming from a family which is cross-border and which has crossed borders to work and crossed thousands of miles to work, I said, well, what if they could work from home? And in the context of the 90s, in terms of anti-immigrant movements and movements to militarize the border, all of it, that idea had resonance on different levels. And so I made a short film in the 90s that had the idea of the telepresent worker in it. But then when I committed to making a feature film project, which was 10 years ago, the film took about 10 years from that first spark to when it was finally realized. Along the way, you have to populate the narrative with other people. And so, it could have been a film that was entirely inhabited by remote workers, but I'm not sure why, but I didn't make that decision. I was interested in the world of the remote worker, a world of militarized borders, but a robust and vastly open net that wraps around the globe. Well, who else is playing in that space? And so I started to think about who would an antagonist be to this protagonist? And this was all thinking I was doing in the 90s. And so, but if I started my search south of the border, somebody who wants to cross or needs to cross for economic reasons, sending his labor digitally across this militarized border, what would be sent back? What's the mirror image? And so through a lot of inspiration, I guess primarily through science fiction. Joseph Haldeman's Forever Peace was an inspiration. And others, I came to this image of the drone and the disembodied soldier as being a kind of perfect antagonist to this protagonist and an embodiment of a kind of circular dynamic, which I think is the actual history of migration, in the sense that we often talk about the border as a place that's crossed and the act of crossing, as if it happens that hour, when the truth is that the crossing of a worker from south to north is the manifestation of hundreds of years of history which have created economic and political imbalances that also create flows of migration. And so the idea of the drone pilot having his migration south, disembodied, sending his labor, a type of labor energy south, which disrupts the life of the main character who then sends his disembodied labor north, and you've got a circular formation there. It just, in terms of writing the drama, protagonist, antagonist, it seemed to make good sense and be sturdy as a dramatic formation. And then who would be the character who could bring them together, and thus emerges the memory seller, the writer, the person who's using this technology not as a form of alienation, but as a form of communication and trying to open up solidarities, which I do think is another function of this networked space. It's not all about alienation, even though I do think there's a great impulse to invent and harness new forms of alienation to enable different agendas and to cement and make more tangible, unequal, and and to me, unjust power relationships. I think that this network technology unleashes a ton of forces in that arena, but it also unleashes forces of cross-border solidarities and some of the things we've discussed about this weekend in terms of spaces for experimentation, play, and contestation. So hence the ménage à trois, as you call it. I've never heard my characters referred to that way, but in French, everything sounds better. Yeah.
Well, one of the elements that I think you bring to the question of dronology is entertainment, as popular entertainment, and you have the drones show that plays itself out. So, you know, this kind of question of military entertainment complex is, you know, a central key point. So that the sense of dronology here isn't that it's necessarily attached to the military structure per se, but to an entertainment structure for defense, so that entertainment itself becomes a site of defense. And one of the qualities perhaps that the drone brings is this lure of entertainment, so that it allows itself to become something more than it is. And even in the final sequence, there's sort of a homage to Star Wars, right? The pilot kind of going in. So there's these echoes of the way entertainment participates in this immaterial labor, how we read it, how we enjoy it. But again, what you do is you twist the codes in it and allow a different kind of context to play itself out. How did the sense of the drone show begin to participate in this context?
Well, again, a lot of the development of the narrative it starts with questions about character and experience that the character is going to live through. So you start internally, but then because it's like a reflex for me to bring a political or a critical type of framework to those kinds of questions. So the question was, I knew my main character would have his home and his kind of life disrupted by this errant drone attack, and it would kill his father, right? And how would he learn about that? And in this kind of pulpy sci-fi landscape that I was working in, I said, well, it would be a very powerful and bizarre experience for my character if he saw it on TV and saw the way that his house and his life were being presented and packaged as enemy and as other, and also then kick him into action in terms of returning home and trying to stop it and being too late. But so it was a dramatic need that he be made aware of that the attack is happening, and then kind of saying, well, what would be the most sort of fun, I guess. There's a sense of just play in terms of the joy of the medium of science fiction itself, and then also the way in which narratives are constructed around these moments, these attacks. And I mean, to me, that's to me one of the most interesting things about the drone is because in terms of its existence in our reality, that it is producing these countless hours, you know, thousands and probably millions of hours of footage of the world, and yet the real weapon is narrative. You know, the real weapon is not the Predator drone nor the Hellfire missile. The real weapon is being able to look at somebody on the ground who's firing a mortar and say that person is an enemy, and we need to obliterate them and erasing them from existence, when the truth is that person is also a father. It's that person who might be firing a mortar at the United States is somebody's son. They're living in Iraq in their own country, which we've occupied. And it's like the erasure of context and history around these incidents, turning what are sons, husbands, fathers, etc., into bad guys, into terrorists in their own countries, even when we're correct about what they're doing in terms of the series of events. But it's like, where do you start the narrative? And so the idea of like packaging this particular attack in a kind of, you know, in one of these heightened forms of narrative in the reality show, and creating a false beginning to this story, which is going to play out on the TV, seemed like a key gesture or something in terms of thinking about what the drone is. And even though it's all seeing, it's really not all knowing. I mean, that the knowing is always about history and longer time frames than we ever discuss in these kinds of violent moments of contact between power and its victims out in the peripheries, you know. And then there was also a great episode of Beavis and Butthead where where I think it's Butthead who watches his own house get raided by cops, and he's making fun. Oh, look at that dumb guy on TV, and he's getting beat by the cops. So this, so the idea of reality TV kind of folding back upon the watcher, maybe I took it from them as well.
Are there some questions that you might have? Yes?
Well, to me, one of my films that I love the most and that's an inspiration is Terry Gilliam's Brazil. And I really believe in, I think the world we live in is quite surreal and just on its face, it's a comedy and surrealist kind of interventions is a very good way to dialogue with our reality. And then it's just, in terms of getting through the days, I think humor is also a good survival technique. And then I also think for for communities that have been kind of locked out of power and access to power in different ways, political comedy and resistant comedy is a long tradition. And in some of my short films, I worked in that language of satire and parody. And the script was intended to be actually a lot funnier than it ended up being. It was an organic and evolving process to find the tone, but because there were moments like, when the drone pilot says, "I killed a man," and then mom says, "But we're so proud of you," like that kind. There was a lot more of that through the whole thing, and I think it was partly the way it was shot. We went with a pretty heavy, kind of high contrast, saturated look. The performances we got, different things didn't always sync up with that kind of slapstick kind of comedy, which there was a lot more of, and not slapstick, but kind of exaggerated dialogues and silliness. There was more silliness, a lot of silliness that ended up on the cutting room floor. But
it's great to see the film finally, actually, after having the storyboards in the gallery for this time, which we started off with. Myself also learning about your work, so it's really fantastic to see. I was really also struck by how you really combined a world that is part folk culture and part tech culture, and really integrated, and the ways in which the technology was really embraced. Of course, in the example of entertainment on television, but also with the live note girls and so on, that there's certainly not really any kind of political or politics sort of embedded in the technology itself. It's really quite neutral, quite accessible, also in many ways, and intertwined with more familiar forms. And so and then sort of through that, in that world, sort of emergence of a kind of ethical consciousness that wasn't there. Because it's sort of like, it seems like a sort of world where there's not really a kind of ethical kind of presence in ways. And this sort of this emergence is sort of striking. And then sort of, I wonder, I have a question here.
no rush. I'm enjoying it.
Okay, I guess the thing then, I was sort of wondering, yeah, we can also maybe comment, you mentioned about also, yeah, the kind of upside that you were also thinking about connectivity, and the idea of actually having the memory network as being a way of one instance of how technology might be used to bring people together, to cultivate new intimacies and new connectivities and new, I think you said something about like new solidarities. But I actually saw that as actually being one of the things that would actually kind of do quite the opposite. So I was sort of wondering your thoughts on that.
In what sense it would do the opposite?
Well, one in which kind of served to quite create more distance than it did actual connection, because of the, for example, when Luz meets maybe there's certain kind of exchange of certain kinds of intimacies, but they're all quite distant in many ways. And in a sense, the kind of solidarities you might form are actually quite illusory. Not, in a sense, you might not think that they would be real.
I mean, I guess there's been a really...
It's like purchasing something which is partly kind of connected to vicariously in some strange way, but not through which you're actually forming any kind of real bonds.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, I guess a couple of things. You know, the film as a drama, again, the first two acts are primarily about, in terms of technology and the experience of the characters, are about these kind of heightening forms of alienation, whether it's the drone pilot realizing that he's a murderer, you know, or whether it's Memo realizing that he's becoming some kind of a zombie with his labor, going to a place that he'll never be able to see or touch, and Luce realizing that by being plugged in and being able to upload images from her body, she's become a kind of walking surveillance camera, even though she had ambitions of being some kind of social issue documentarian, right? So the first two acts, the characters kind of find themselves in these increasingly alienated and unpleasant positions in relation to technology. And then the third act is where they kind of are able to twist the Rubik's Cube and find some power and strike back for a moment, you know? And I think that it's 65% alienation and 35% connection and rebellion is, to me, it's not, I think that's about the right balance in terms of how I see the technology actually impacting in our real lived existence. I do think that, for me, I can see in terms of the interests of capital, the ways in which the global network, both the network to move commodities, to move capital physically around the planet, as well as information systems to allow data to move. I can see the use for corporations crystal clear. I've got no doubt it creates advantageous relationships of labor for owners. There's no doubt. And then in terms of like the state, and the military apparatus, I see no doubt in terms of what it means in terms of an advantage, the way we've been discussing advantage and asymmetrical warfare, et cetera, in this conference. I can see crystal clear how a telepresent robotic army creates a set of advantages. As an optimist and a humanist and somebody, I feel like, but that can't be the whole story. I know there must be some other way in which these technological changes are opening something else up. And I think we see it in ways, but it's a matter of debate. And but to me, like things I would point to are things like the World Social Forums, where you can have the landless movement in Brazil dialoguing with the movement against genetically modified crops in India, and a conversation happening there that's enabled by the digital net that literally like those communities had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would never be able to even be aware of each other's existences. So just communication technology, I feel like it has to open up some new countervailing spaces, some spaces of resistance and solidarity as an optimist, but I think it must be possible. But I know, I was also really struck by Occupy last year and how much the power of it was, in my opinion, a lot in the body. The old technology, the body, its presence, sitting down, sitting in a public space, not moving, being there 24 hours a day. And that old technology of simple presence having great power, perhaps exactly in this landscape of connectivity, virtuality, distance, alienation. But anyways, long story short, I feel like there must be in this technological, in all these shifts, it can't all be about new forms of alienation and exploitation. There has to be something else that's happening, even though I can't say I totally know what it is in terms of the space to push back. And a space that you could say, yeah, as much as this technology enables corporations to offshore and create hyper profit by selling in a market and like selling their products in the United States market, but doing all of their activities of production outside and moving like mercury around the planet rapidly, and how that, okay, so that's what, but what does the technology offer the labor movement that could control that force, and I have to believe something, but I don't know what it is. Maybe somebody else here does, or maybe I'm asking the wrong question.
Last question, yeah.
Fabulous movie, thank you so much. And I jotted down a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm only going to pick a couple of things here. plugging in, why not sell, the labor across the border and let, them plug in down there? I mean, we're already outsourcing to Blackwater and so on. So that's kind of just a figure that's unsure. If you have kids, you won't want them to miss this. I think Fox is going to be running that this fall. And the workers building iPads, they are workers for hire. They don't use the products they're building, and they, switch. It's Apple one day and Hewlett Packard the next, and Dell Computer the next day after that. So I think they're already selling their labor remotely, never being part of the product chain other than the labor part. So I think that's already happening in several ways. So I was just struck by futurist movies, how much we get close to the mark and how much will be wildly off the mark. But I think we came very close on a lot of points already.
I guess thank you and I'm sorry or something. It's like.
Well, just to touch on the outsourcing of drones, you can certainly see when you look at the recent reports on the market, right, the economy of drones, as the profits move up, you see a larger and larger percentage. I think in the next couple of years, in the market reports, was 40% of the drones being built will be for other countries or other private entities. So as this decade moves up, perhaps you'll see a lower amount of drones for what we imagine the originating impulse of the nation was and outsourced beyond. So just my last question for Alex, was I the cause for Memo's dad being killed?
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
I thought
it.
so.
It's, there's the book on, I'm sure it went by too quickly for most folks that are seeing it the first time, but Memo has this book on his desk that says Hackear para principiantes, and it's translated as Hacking for Beginners, and the author is R. Dominguez. But anyways, yeah, absolutely. When I met Ricardo in his discussions of the Mayan hackers and the Zapatista floodnet, and this film is very much a product of growing up in a community of thinkers: Guillermo Gomez Peño, Lalo Alcaraz, Coco Fusco, Lourdes Portillo, a whole set of thinkers and artists working in the border space, trying to construct possibilities and critical visualities around in that space. And so this film is very much, to me, a kind of choral expression. And I hope to get to make another one someday.
That's what I hope so. So that we move from the Coyotec of wetbacks to the Coyotec of wet minds. Right?
Wet minds.
Muchas gracias.